An NXT star is getting called up to the main roster, and we're going to talk about it in this video. But let me remind you, WWE is opening up the transfer portal between Raw, SmackDown, and NXT. And through the next several weeks, we're going to see some stars being moved around, and it's obviously very much needed. Raw is moving to 3 hours on Netflix. SmackDown is moving to 3 hours on USA, and NXT remains at 2 hours. But NXT has a very major problem, and if you don't know what it is, they are having a very hard time stacking up the men's world title picture. Obafemi just won the Iron Survivor Challenge, which is great, but that doesn't solve the problem. So how does it solve the problem when another NXT star is getting called up to the main roster? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to show you guys the roster for Raw and SmackDown. We're going to talk about this, but first, let's talk about the NXT call-up, because this is a good one. And right now, if the rosters were to remain the same, the way it currently is at this very moment, it is very clear that WWE needs help establishing a stronger mid-card for WWE SmackDown. Now, obviously, this transfer portal thing will actually help with that, but if Shinsuke Nakamura remains on SmackDown, then this NXT call-up makes the most sense. Now, who could we be talking about? Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about Ethan Page. After his departure from AEW, it was very, very, very clear that when he went to NXT, WWE was very high up on Ethan Page. Now, how did we get to that opinion? Well, that was very simple. Because in NXT, what we saw was Ethan Page get hot-shotted immediately to the world title picture. He won the belt and then eventually dropped it to Trick Williams, and now he's suffering losses in NXT. And granted, WWE has done a relatively good job of justifying those booking decisions. They've done a really good job even handling the booking regarding his losses. But it is evidently clear Ethan Page is not going to benefit from NXT, and NXT is not going to benefit from Ethan Page. Now, Ethan Page is somebody on NXT who can go to the United States title picture and be a very credible champion. He can help add some depth to the mid-card, especially at a place where Ethan Page could then join Andrade, Carmelo Hayes, Shinsuke Nakamura. That would be a great addition. Ethan Page is not the only one. There's a couple others, but Ethan Page is clearly the guy that can go to SmackDown and immediately help boost the mid-card title picture. Now, I want to say this. We don't know if Shinsuke will remain on SmackDown or go to Raw, but my belief, and for the purpose of this video, I believe that Shinsuke will remain on SmackDown. I don't think we're going to see champions move shows, but I do think we're going to see some very big changes. So Ethan Page going to SmackDown would be a really good idea, because that is one of the needs that SmackDown currently has. Now, there's some other NXT call-ups, and I do want to discuss that because I do believe a few more will be going. But I think the best thing we could do is take a look at the roster together, and we could discuss some potential call-ups. So right here is the NXT roster on WWE.com. Ariana Grace is doing some cool stuff in NXT TNA. Fraxium is doing some cool stuff as TNA Tag Team Champions. None of these people really stand out as potential call-ups. Not saying that Brooks Jensen can't be called up to Raw or SmackDown. Not saying Shawn Spears can't be called up either. But we got to take a look at the need. And essentially, when I see NXT, I look at No Quarter Catch Crew as a very big potential call-up for WWE. WWE main roster loves factions, and I look at No Quarter Catch Crew as a very big potential call-up. So it seems like Ethan Page is for sure going, but now bring in No Quarter Catch Crew. It makes a lot of sense, because again, you got to beef up the tag team division, which you could do with Miles Bourne, and of course, you can, you got to factor in Tavion Heights, who is also doing some great things. Charlie Dempsey, the leader of the group. Ren Sinclair, a member of the group. You could get some really good stuff out of them. Also, I think Metaphor is somebody that should be called up. We haven't seen Metaphor altogether, but we just recently saw Jakara Jackson and Lash Legend. I would fully expect them to be called up to the main roster. I think it would be a very smart idea having Oro Menza and Noam Dar, all four of them together. Raw or SmackDown, it doesn't really matter, but I would definitely do that because they don't really have much left to do in NXT either. Now, if we continue to go down the list, there are plenty of women who can get called up. Obviously, WWE, they're building around the women's division. Gigi Dolan just returned. I wouldn't mind seeing Gigi Dolan getting called up. But then we got to take a look at Gallus, right? Gallus is another group where I don't think we're going to see them do much more in NXT. So if maybe No Quarter Catch Crew gets called up, or if they don't get called up, you know, you can have Gallus move up to the main roster. I still think the idea of Gallus working with Drew McIntyre is a fun one, which would be really cool. Lexus King is being built up relatively well, so I think he's going to remain in NXT, but I don't think we're going to see that many more call-ups. I mean, granted, WWE can always bring back Ridge Holland if they so choose, now that he's kind of been rebranded in NXT, but I don't really see him doing much on the main roster as it currently stands. Now, other than that, everybody else should be remaining in NXT. I know they want to build up Wesley, but at some point he'll get called up. I just don't think now is the time. But now if we take a look at Raw, I mean, if you take a look at their roster on Raw, everybody is relatively used unless they are injured. Carlito is one that should actually move to NXT. I'm not a big fan of the Judgment Day. I've been really clear on that. I'm not a big fan of what this Judgment Day stuff has turned into. So Carlito is the guy that I for sure think we should definitely move him. Let him get a singles run. He's a veteran. I'm not saying he has to win championships, but move him to NXT, get him away from the Judgment Day. Let that group fall apart. It's not my favorite. I think that group lost a lot of aura. Carlito should get moved. I think if you look at the rest of the roster, aside from injuries, almost everybody is relatively being used. I think some people could be used better. I think Elba Fire, Isla Dawn could probably benefit from being moved around. It just really depends on the women's tag team division. But for the most part, everybody here is being used. I fully expect Ludwig Kaiser to go to SmackDown, talking about beefing up that mid-card. If Ludwig moves to SmackDown and keeps him away from Gunther, there's no storyline split, so they can always revisit that. But Ludwig Kaiser should be a singles guy. I'm looking at the U.S. title picture, Shinsuke Nakamura holding the belt, LA Knight, Carmelo Hayes, Andrade. You add an Ethan Page from NXT, you move Ludwig Kaiser to SmackDown, you could get some really cool stuff out of there. And then obviously everybody else is still being relatively used. I don't want to see Pete Dunne get moved. I want to see him keep doing his thing. Obviously WWE's kind of doing a slow burn with him anyways. But everybody else is being relatively used. Tyler Bate is currently injured. Yeah, I think Raw is pretty much it's going to be interesting how they do this because they're probably going to move some people. Now, with that being said, if you look at SmackDown, this is where things get interesting. Apollo Crews should be more utilized on the SmackDown mid-card, but he's not. I feel bad for this guy because he could go down to NXT. We saw him move to NXT, did some really cool stuff, got called back up to the main roster, only for them to not really utilize him. So Apollo Crews should either move to Raw, get involved in the Intercontinental title scene, or move to NXT, get him involved in the world title scene. Because again, NXT needs that help. Now, if we continue to go down the list, Theory and Grayson Waller are still together. It wouldn't be a bad idea for them to finally break them up because both guys could be inserted in the mid-card title scene. Maybe the transfer portal will allow them to break up, very similar to Gunther and Ludwig Kaiser. I think, Blair Davenport, a hell of a talent, not really getting a lot of TV time. Move her to NXT. Let her go out there with Julia and Stephanie Vaquer. She's a very top talent who would benefit from it. Cedric Alexander. I want to see him on NXT as a mainstay in NXT. I think Cedric Alexander is such a great talent, but for some reason he's not getting a lot of shine. So there's a lot of things you could do there. I think the Bloodline moves to Raw. I think if you look at SmackDown, if the Bloodline moves to Raw, SmackDown's going to be without a group. Maybe you move the Y6 to the group. But definitely some interesting stuff there. Obviously, Ethan Page getting called up makes a lot of sense, but I figured we'd talk about it all in today's video, and hopefully you guys enjoyed.